Welcome to Unequal India Decoded, a podcast from the Tax Justice Network where we dissect economic inequalities in one of the most unequal countries in the world. I'm Raksha Kumar and I've been working as a journalist for over 15 years now. I report from different parts of the country on issues of social and economic justice. Have you ever done that thing where you've written a letter to your younger self? It was quite a fad on social media some time ago. Perhaps it's still a good exercise for those who need closure. I have always been curious as to what would happen if we tweaked the exercise a bit. What if we went into the future and looked at our present times? What do you think we would find? Let me see, at least two wars being fought simultaneously in different parts of the world, chaos, unprecedented hunger, excessive addiction to devices, country after country being ruled by unstable leaders, and some soap opera level drama in geopolitics. Well, would you see the end of US's dominance over the world economy, like some observers are saying? I have asked many people how that makes them feel. Those who are more averse to change hate the idea, and those who are less averse to it are ambivalent. I think it's quite exciting to be able to experience gigantic shifts. Don't get me wrong, it's rough and stormy, but it is also a time when we have the power to shape our futures definitively. I'm guessing those who witnessed the dissolution of the USSR in the late 1980s leading up to 1991 would have probably said the same. So, if we stood in 2050 and looked back at 2025, would we be able to say that we contributed to bolstering the alternatives to US dominance? Or would we say the world collapsed into more chaos while we watched from the fences? By many accounts, BRICS, the group of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and a few other countries now, can offer a stable alternative to the US in the world economy. This can flatten out inequalities to some extent. Clearly, this has Donald Trump on edge. But if we choose to leave Trump's anxiety aside, as we should, and look at the grouping objectively, what will we find? So, this month, even as news changes every day, depending on whether Donald Trump woke up on the wrong side of the bed or not, it is crucial we talk about BRICS Plus. And as of today, BRICS Plus nations contribute to about 40% of the world's economy and house about 50% of its people. But, and here's the crucial but, most of the exports from the BRICS Plus countries are going to the West. The world economy is tilting in favor of the Western countries despite everything. And India is a significant member of BRICS. So, in the last few weeks, so much has happened, right? The Trump Modi relationship has gone from one of bromance to Trump canceling Modi altogether. Trump called Indian economy a dead economy. He hit India with one of the highest tariffs, something that has made analysts wonder why. The India US trade deal broke down over opening up of India's agricultural sector. So, a lot has happened that has made many observers in India believe that Indian companies should diversify their client base. India should trade more with other countries. And in this respect, India has the advantage of being a founder member of BRICS. In order to understand the implications of current churning in the world economy and how BRICS can actually offer stability to its members, I spoke to Jayati Ghosh, professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, about the potential of BRICS in bringing about a balance to global trade.
There's a bunch of countries that has also joined. And that actually makes it quite significant, especially now when Trump's tariffs have become, what shall I say, a means of not just destabilizing global trade, but of forcing all countries in the world to look for plan B. So BRICS is one way of doing plan B. And by the way, I would argue that BRICS, the big impetus didn't even come from Trump, it came from Mr. Biden, Because when you impose sanctions on a country, now the US is famous for imposing sanctions, right? Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, etc. But you do it to a big country like Russia, and you then freeze the bank accounts. The dollar reserves held in the US are frozen, even though that's illegal actually under international law. You can't do that. And you say, well, we're not going to allow you to use SWIFT, the international clearing system. Now that makes every country in the world sit up and think, oh, wait a minute, tomorrow, if they decide they don't like me, they can freeze my reserves held in US dollar, and they can get me out of the exchange clearing system. So there are alternatives. The BRICS are trying to develop BRICS Clear, which is an alternative system. The Chinese have got much more aggressively into renminbi swaps, which allows a lot of countries to trade directly with them without going through the dollar at all.
And that's true of India and Russia as well, right? We do ruble, rupee.
That's true of India and Russia as well.
Yeah,
Yes, I mean
yeah.
India less successfully because nobody really wants our rupee so much.
Yeah,
But you see the
yeah.
potential there. You see how, if not a BRICS currency necessarily, that would take a much longer time. But you are already getting different means of exchange. You're getting trade credits. You're getting different currency swap arrangements. All of this is happening. The other thing you have to notice is that the Middle Eastern countries, the new entries into BRICS, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., they have been very aggressively now investing directly in a bunch of countries. So, earlier the oil surpluses would all go into Western banks, and then the Western banks would decide where they went, which is how they've always been mediated. Increasingly, you find that these are countries investing their surpluses directly, and they're playing a role in North Africa and in other countries of the Middle East. They are playing a role in different countries. It's something that will emerge later. People aren't talking about it so much because everyone's obsessed with China, but this is going to be something important in the next few years.
Right. So there's a lot happening at the moment. But despite everything, Jayati says BRICS countries have been a bit sluggish.
So, in a sense, the basic problem, the power that the IMF gets, and the IMF strategies are really driven by the US and Europe entirely. That hasn't gone away. And it's a surprise, I think, to many of us why they have been so low on ambition, why the BRICS alternative institutions have been relatively less ambitious. Maybe things will change. I certainly hope things will change now.
Do you think it's because they are also very diverse internally? I mean, they also have
Yes,
competing interests. They have, interests that don't really match.
that's absolutely the case. This is a real mixture of all kinds of very, very different economies: oil surplus economies, merchandise surplus economies, massively deficit economies, potentially large economies. It's a mix of all kinds of things. There are two ways in which I think they could make a difference. One is if they enable more issue based coalitions. And that's something that already started with the Financing for Development conference in Sevilla. They created these Seville platforms for action. The idea is that progressive governments who have an agenda on an issue, it doesn't have to be you agree on everything else, but you are sharing a common agenda on some issue and you agree to work together on that. And these can be regional. I mean, in Latin America, they have PT-LAC, which is the Alliance for Progressive Taxation in Latin America. And there are 12 countries who are members. So they're sharing information, they're sharing strategies, and they're enabling things like wealth taxation, which is very difficult for a small country to try and do. They're always scared that there will be capital flight and so on. But all of that it's pushed by PT-LAC. But now there is also a specific wealth tax platform, and some countries are part of it, but other countries may join. In Sevilla, the idea was that there would be a platform for debtors to get together. And once again, exchange information, exchange strategies, say, okay, the IMF asked you to do this. Well, they asked us to do that. And how come you got better deals than I did? And so on. So, all of these things, I think, can play a role. So, the BRICS, if you think of it again as not a grouping so much as a platform from where you can get different kinds of cooperation, really, because the old multilateral system is not delivering. We all know that. Increasingly, what countries are beginning to realize is that having relied on the IMF as the multilateral way out and so on, they now see it as an explicit instrument of very aggressive national interests of rich countries who are frankly no longer that dynamic. And that means that increasingly, I believe, countries are going to think of other ways out.
Depending on how you look at it, these times can be very challenging or exciting. Thank you so much, Jayati, for your time and insights. And now, as I had promised in the last episode, we are kicking off a new series which will look at how the colonial period created inequalities in India that one can see even now. We call this segment the story of the rupee. Professor Surajit Mazumdar teaches economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. He spoke to me about how taxation created during the colonial period is casting its shadow even now on the Indian society.
One part of the relationship between Britain and India involved what came to be called the drain of wealth. Now, the drain was essentially a process in which you extracted a surplus out of the production activity that took place in India, and it was transported out of India with nothing coming back in exchange. So, it is a unilateral transfer of something that happens in India, of income that is generated in India by production that takes place in India. And this worked through the taxation system. So essentially, the revenue that accrued to the states. So originally, the East India Company, where after it acquired the Diwani of Bengal in the 18th century after the Battle of Plassey, essentially it acquired the right to claim the revenue that customarily all rulers in India had. The land revenue, which was a part of the value that was generated in agricultural activity, had to be paid to the ruler, and from that, a whole class of aristocrats used to be basically maintained. Now, the difference that the East India Company's acquisition of the right to receive revenue did was that the East India Company used this revenue to replace its use of gold and silver brought from Europe to purchase the products that it bought in India and sold in Europe. What that did was therefore that from an exchange process where gold and silver were flowing towards India and in exchange Indian products were going out towards Europe, became a unilateral transfer. Indian income was used to purchase these Indian products and they were shipped out of India. So what was a bilateral exchange became a unilateral transfer. While it originated during the East India Company period and was linked up with the East India Company's trading activities, in one way or the other, this transfer continued throughout the period of colonial rule.
So, when you say throughout colonial rule, you mean while the East India Company was in charge and also when the British Crown was in charge after 1857?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. This continued right up till the end of British rule in India, covering both the period of the Raj as well as the East India Company period. So, begin in the East India Company period, and the forms that it uses changes with the British Raj. So, once the British Crown directly takes over India, it's not a trading entity, but the same process where, and it came to be called, one part of it came to be called the home charges, which were basically sterling expenditures that were financed out of revenue generated in India. And corresponding to this income transfer was, of course, also a commodity surplus being extracted from India, which was taken out of India and didn't come back. Then nothing was received in exchange. That is why you had this situation where India had an export surplus for most of the period of colonial rule, where it exported more to the rest of the world than it bought from the rest of the world. And yet, that was not an export surplus that generated an expansionary momentum to India's economy. It's not like China's export surplus and export led growth. It didn't produce growth. In fact, It was an extraction out of India, which took the form of export. You also had India, may of course, used as a market for British manufacturing industry, which led to the destruction of India's own traditional manufacturing industry, what we call the process of deindustrialization. So you had this process where, in a sense, what was being extracted out of India was at the same time having the effect of compressing the economy, which formed the basis for that transfer. And this contradiction expresses itself in this contradiction and the political imperatives of maintaining colonial rule produces changes over time in the sources of the revenues which form the basis for this transfer. So historically, the most important source of revenue in the East India Company period and much of the 19th century, even after the Crown directly establishes control over India, was the land revenue. But over a period of time, you have a reduction in the weight of land revenue in the total revenues. And this is partly driven by the fact that not because the part that is remaining with the actual cultivators is increasing, but because the revenue systems that the British created resulted in the creation of a landed class, which kind of, in a sense, shared in the extraction from the cultivators. So while the cultivators remained in extreme poverty, the part surplus that was extracted from them had to be shared between the state and the class of with property rights in land that were in some senses partly created by the revenue systems that the British put in place in order to guarantee and ensure that this revenue stream would be sustained so that the transfer from India could be sustained without any disruption. Now, over a period of time, the political imperatives of trying to maintain this condition led to a change in the distribution of that surplus between the government and the landowning class in favor of the landowning class, and the land revenue, the importance in revenues tended to decline. The effect of this political imperative was also seen in one consequence of India's direct tax structure, which survives till this day. So, one of the ways in which this revenue issue was sought to be addressed, one of the taxes that was introduced by the British was the income tax. The income tax, generating the income tax, however, there was a problem that on the one side there were these high income British officials who were here, who were paid high salaries in order to incentivize them coming to India and serving the British administration here. So you couldn't tax them very heavily. So but they were one high income category that was there. Another high income category that was emerging was this basically these landowning classes. This is in the late 19th century. Income tax was introduced in India in the 1870s or so. But soon after its introduction, agricultural income was exempted from income tax. And this exemption of agricultural income from income tax is something that persists till date. So that even when there was there was a section within agriculture who had very high incomes, they were not obliged to pay income tax. And of course, over time, it also became possible to use this particular route to invoke taxes on incomes generated in other activities because you could show it if you could show it as agricultural income. Income generated in other activities, yeah. So this is something that has persisted till date. Uh, that this particular taxation. Now, if you can't therefore use income taxes, essentially you had a heavy reliance on what you would call indirect taxes. And the burden of these indirect taxes also fell. So basically, you had a taxation structure evolving under British rule, where the burden on high income groups was kept in check, and you essentially relied on various taxes which could be one way or the other levied on the general population which had extremely low incomes. So if you look at the salt tax, which was a major issue in our national movement also, because it affected a large number of people. And excise duty is salt tax. So a structure which relied heavily on indirect taxes was the tendency that was generated by the colonial context, which remained an enduring feature of India's taxation structure after independence. So there are two aspects to it. One is that if you have an income distribution which normal economic working produces, which is highly unequal, if you do not use direct taxes significantly to tax those with higher incomes heavily, and you rely more on indirect taxes. So, with regard to those who have the means to pay higher taxes, you have a political constraint. For one other reason, you don't tax them. And on the other side, you have a more fundamental economic constraint that those who have very little, even when you impose a taxes on them, the burden of taxation on them, there are limits beyond which you can't take that because they have in any case very little to pay. The consequence, therefore, of a taxation structure which relies heavily on indirect taxes is to keep the overall share of taxes in income itself low. And this, in a sense, is something the kind of the structure and in many ways that orientation of Indian taxation was created during the colonial period. Because the direct taxes, income taxes and all, who would they be levied on? Okay, so in the colonial era, either they were landed groups who had large amounts of land from which they received a large amount of rent, who had high incomes, or zamindars or other categories of uh, those property rights in land. You had, of course, businessmen who had high incomes, and those businessmen also, significant part of them were of European origin, who were here primarily because of the colonial context. And you had British officials who worked here who received high salaries. So the government of India paid high salaries to a small stratum of its employees who were basically those who came from Britain to serve the administration in India. So they were paid high salaries. Each of these categories, they were compulsion, the constraints which, in the logic of colonialism, worked towards keeping their taxation burden low. Which means that you only have the scope for taxing the rest of the population through indirect taxes. There too, there are limits because of the economic constraints, and there's also under colonial rule, there were also some political imperatives. How far could you push the burden of taxation on ordinary people without inviting rebellion? There were political constraints on that which worked to ensure that the level of taxation relative to the total national income itself remained low. This was true during the colonial period and after the end of colonialism. If you look at the trajectory of development of the tax to GDP ratio in India, it was moved up over time, before liberalization, primarily on account of indirect taxes. That's the method that has been used so that the majority of the taxes in India, of central and state governments combined, come from indirect taxes. But it is also combined with keeping the tax to GDP ratio relatively low. And this has had an impact on inequality in two sectors. One is, of course, the direct effect. You've done not being able to use taxation and expenditure as a means of some kind of redistribution. And secondly, you are not able to finance the economic activities of the state, which could in the long run affect how the income is in this country is distributed. But the origins of that go back to the colonial period.
Thank you so much, Professor Mazumdar. We will continue this conversation in future episodes. It is our attempt to understand the past so that we make our future a little better. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast application you use, or through our website podcast.taxjustice.net. Tell us what you think about the podcast and anything else you might want to hear by emailing us on unequalindia@taxjustice.net. There are links in the show notes that give you more context to everything we've spoken about today. You've been listening to Unequal India Decoded from the Tax Justice Network. I'm Raksha Kumar, and we'll be back next month. Thank you for listening in.